Welcome all. I am happy to welcome you to our webinar titled Empowering Choice, Exploring Self-Direction Experiences and Outcomes Among National Core Indicator Respondents. This is a joint effort of several speakers and associations. My name is Rosa Plasencia and I work with NCI-IDD at Advancing States. This webinar was spearheaded by HSRI in remembrance of their colleague Sarah Taub. We have a really incredible group for you here today, and I'll ask our speakers to go ahead and introduce themselves. Next slide, please. Val, do you want to go first?
Yes. Hi, I'm Val Bradley. I'm the President Emerita of the Human Services Research Institute. And my interest in self-direction goes back to the 90s when we worked on the Robert Wood Johnson demonstration, and it's been a passion of mine ever since. So welcome.
Hi, my name is Lindsay Dubois. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a middle-aged white woman in my office, and behind me are pictures my children have drawn. In my background, I'm wearing a white shirt, and I've got blonde hair and glasses. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, I'm Molly Morris. I'm the Vice President at Applied Self-Direction, and I also use she, her pronouns, and I am a middle-aged white woman with blonde hair, and I have a black turtleneck on and a dark floral curtain in the background. Looking forward to talking to everybody today.
Hi, my name is Alicia Burma. I work for the State of Wisconsin Department of Health Services. I am a white woman with brown hair and brown eyes, and I'm sitting in my living room with a couch and art and piano in the background. Good to see everyone.
Oops, sorry. Good afternoon. My name is Christian Brand. I'm also from the Wisconsin Department of Health Services. I'm a white middle-aged man with a shaved head and a beard. I'm wearing a blue sport coat and a white shirt, and I'm in my small home office with a bookcase behind me. Great to be here.
Thank you so much, everyone. You can go ahead and jump to the next slide. And I apologize, I missed my visual description. I'm a middle-aged woman with light olive skin, wavy brown hair, and a blue turtleneck, and I do have a cold today, so sorry about that. So a few logistics to keep in mind. Participants will be muted during this webinar. Please use the Q&A feature in Zoom to ask questions and communicate via chat in the hosts. Toward the end of the webinar, panelists will have an opportunity to respond to questions that have been entered in the Q&A, so we will be watching for them. The webinar will be captioned live in English and live interpreted in Spanish and ASL. Live English captions can be accessed by clicking the CC button, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And live Spanish interpretation can be accessed by clicking the interpretation button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, which is the world icon. Once in Spanish channel, please silence the original audio. Se puede acceder a la interpretación en español en vivo haciendo clic en el botón Interpretation en la parte inferior de la pantalla de Zoom, alguna del mundo. Una vez en el canal español, por favor silencie el audio original. Due to a recent Zoom update, full accessibility may not work if you're joining with a mobile device, and slides can no longer be viewed simultaneously via a tablet or phone. So please swipe on your mobile device to find the ASL interpreter if you need to. This live webinar includes polls and evaluation questions. We appreciate your interaction throughout. The webinar will be recorded and posted to YouTube at a later date, and slides will be available on your website. Val, I'm turning it over to you. Thank you.
Hi, this is Val again, and I did also neglected to say I'm a middle-aged woman. Well, no, that's not true. I'm a much older woman with red hair, wearing a black sweater with white stripes. I'm sitting in my somewhat cluttered office with plants and bookcases behind me. I use she, her pronouns. This webinar is named after a colleague of ours, a dear colleague of ours named Sarah Taub. Sarah, before she passed away, was the National Core Indicators Director until 2013, when a very aggressive cancer took her life, much to all of our sorrow. Her mission and purpose was really an essential part of the growth of NCI and has made it what it is today. She was a very fierce advocate for people with disabilities and advocated for their representation at all levels of the work that we do. She never really let us forget who were the people behind the numbers. So that's why we've called these webinars the Sarah Taub webinars. Next slide, Dorothy. So this is what we hope you will get out of this webinar today. First, to increase your knowledge in general about self-direction and people's experiences with self-direction. We want to share some best practices, some exemplary practices that will hopefully give you some ideas about how to expand the opportunity for self-direction in your states. We want to show how NCI data highlight the characteristics and outcomes of people who are using self-direction. And then we want to speculate on some of the additional areas that we really should be exploring in the future. Next slide, Dorothy. So now we want to take a minute just to find out who's in our audience and for you to give us a bit of a self-assessment about really how familiar you are with self-direction. So we're going to launch a poll. So can you describe yourselves? Just check whichever best characterizes you. Okay, now we need to go to the next poll. Is that right, Laura? So please rate your knowledge of self-direction supports. 0 being next to nothing, 5 being a lot. Great, and Laura, are we ready to see the results? Okay, so in terms of knowledge, some people with a lot of knowledge and a bit of knowledge looks like a fairly knowledgeable group, with some people still here to learn more. That's great, thank you. And how about who's here, Laura? So we have a few people with lived experience, a few more family members and advocates. Good, some public managers working at the state level, case managers who are absolutely crucial to this whole process, some policymakers, some service providers, and great, some researchers. So a real interesting, diverse group. Thank you so much. Next slide, Dorothy. So let's do a brief overview on the history of self-direction. Next slide, please, Dorothy. So in the traditional model, which I assume you're all pretty familiar with, the public money goes directly to the provider. And the services are basically driven by the case manager and the service provider. We call that sort of a wholesale model. The self-direction model is really more of a retail model. The public funds go to an individual's support budget, and it is up to the individual then to determine which services they want to purchase, which goods and services they want to take advantage of. So the responsibility of forming the service package is on the individual. Next slide, please. So self-direction, certainly in my judgment, is really part of a larger human right that we all have to self-direction, which really asserts that we all should have agency in our lives and that we have control over the decisions that really determine the course of our lives. Self-direction really reflects the promise of self-determination by putting power in the hands of people who need supports to design and purchase services and supports that closely align with their own choices about the course of their lives. Next slide, please, Dorothy. Here's a brief timeline. These are sort of some of the major milestones over time. Important to know that self-direction goes back even to 1953 in California, where people who were recovering from polio were given the ability to purchase their own personal care attendants. That program now is a huge part of services in California. In the 1980s, Massachusetts, California, a few other states, at the pressure from the independent living movement, gave people with physical disabilities the ability to purchase their own personal care attendants. In 95, cash and counseling came along, which really made it possible to cash out certain public benefits for older adults, people with physical disabilities, again, to use the money as they wish for the services they needed. The amount of institutionalization among that group went down as a consequence. In 97, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation funded 19 states to plant seeds around self-direction. In 2003, according to CMS, self-direction became a service option for multiple groups through the use of HCBS waivers. And in 2023, year before last, there were 260 self-direction programs around the country, serving a total of 1,520,267 individuals. And how do we know that? Because of our friends at Applied Self-Direction, whom you're going to hear from next. Molly?
Val, I think you have one more slide to cover. Do you want me to jump in?
Back, Dorothy, sorry, just very quickly. Because self-direction is not a national program with national standards and expectations, states vary significantly in how they implement self-direction. Some states use their own state case managers to be support brokers. Other states contract. Some states allow people to have their own personal facilitator or personal agent as part of their budget. The supports that people are likely to purchase vary widely from state to state, including staffing and goods and services. Populations in each state may vary. The magnitude of those populations may vary. And finally, there are a multitude of funding authorities that states use to support self-direction, including 1915C, K, I, the Older Americans Act, State General Fund, and then there's even a Veterans Administration program for self-directed veterans care. And now I will pass it on to our good friend, Molly.
Thank you so much, Val, and thanks everybody. I'm glad to be here again. This is Molly, and I am with an organization called Applied Self-Direction. Just a little background about us. We are really a mission-driven organization, and our singular focus is on advancing self-direction, understanding all things self-direction. We try to serve as a national hub that really provides technical assistance, training, community building to be that resource around this model. We serve many different stakeholders, from state agencies to financial management services providers, managed care organizations to participant and advocacy groups, support brokers, basically all of you in the different categories that you indicated on the survey. We're here to be a resource. So we can go to the next slide. So I'm going to be really giving some background and context that I think is going to give you a little bit of the lay of the land when we get more into what Lindsay's going to talk about with the findings on self-direction from the National Core Indicator Study. But I'm going to give you a sense of the broad landscape nationally of the growth of self-direction, pulling from our recent self-direction national inventory from 2023. And that project was really all about measuring the kind of breadth and scope of self-direction offerings across the country. This is a study we've been conducting every 3 years since 2011. So we have that historical data that continues to give us a better picture of trends year over year. The data that we collected in 2023 is notable for a couple of reasons. One, it was the first time we did an inventory post-pandemic. And so we wanted to know what was the impact of the pandemic specifically on self-direction, and I'll talk about that in a bit. We certainly coincided with a huge wave of new interest in self-direction, both at the participant and program level. And while we have seen consistent, steady growth every 3 years that we've measured, we saw a sharper rate of enrollment in 2023. Just more states implementing new programs and program expansions than at any point in the previous decade, which is really exciting. So I'm going to talk more about that today. If we go to the next slide. I just want to give you a little more context about our methods. Oh, sorry, it looks like some of the text is a little small on the slide. I don't know how that happened. But the program data I'm going to refer to today was collected from October 2022 through February 2023. So I generally refer to it as the 2023 data. We collected this data through initially a very in-depth review of publicly available documentation about publicly funded self-direction programs. Then we conducted interviews. We were able to have 65 interviews with state staff from 43 states. And we did have at least some form of correspondence, including email, with administrators in every state. In a few cases, enrollment data isn't available for self-direction from administrators. We were then able to contact financial management services providers to provide that data, or we used enrollment estimates that are often included in Medicaid documentation. Finally, as a quality check, we work with a community of state administrators and financial management services providers at Applied Self-Direction. We shared our initial data with that group as a quality check to make sure that the numbers we collected kind of looked right to people in the industry who know particular programs. So next slide, please. So I talked about this spike in enrollment. So from 2019 to 2023, we actually saw a 23% increase in enrollment. So by comparison, from 2016 to 2019, it was a 17% increase. So that's a bigger spike that we were excited to see. As Val mentioned, we found 1.5 million people self-directing nationwide. And for perspective on this, I have a chart on the slide, and you can see in 2011, there was about 700,000 plus people self-directing. And year over year, 2013, that was up to 800K plus. 2016, we just crested 1 million. 2019, we got to 1.2 million and then up to 1.5. So you see that this is a program that just continues to grow. So we look at the next slide. And of course, I was just talking about national numbers, but self-direction enrollment increases do vary state to state. So when we collected this data in 2023, most states reported an increase in self-direction enrollment. Those 44 states, but a few did report a decrease. And as Val mentioned, California was an early adopter of self-direction, and it's a very large state. So it has always, in our national accounting of enrollment, tended to be, well over 50% of people self-directing live in California. That percentage has continued to decrease. And in 2023, for the first time, less than 50% of people self-directing live in California. So that just shows nationally we're seeing greater growth, not saying California is getting smaller. We also had 6 states that more than doubled self-direction enrollment. So had huge leaps: Alabama, Connecticut, DC, Florida, Maryland, South Dakota. So go to the next slide. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about some major trends that we've seen from this data and from our interviews with states. One is that, there are a variety of different funding sources for self-direction, publicly available funding sources. By far, the Medicaid 1915C waiver is the most frequently used source, but other authority uses are growing, and I'm going to talk about that in a bit. So next slide. we talk a lot about Medicaid self-direction, but the Veterans Health Administration also has their own self-direction program called Veteran Directed Care. Really exciting. From 2019 to 2023, we saw a 157% increase in enrollment, which is the difference between an average of 33 veterans per site to 88 veterans per site. So huge, huge growth. And on the next slide, can talk briefly about why that is. For one, the Veterans Health Administration has really committed to making veteran-directed care available to every Veteran Affairs Medical Center by 2026. And just this month, the Elizabeth Dole HCBS Act was signed into law, which also has some really ambitious goals for veteran-directed care. So exciting to see that growth. Next slide, please. The availability of self-direction does vary by population. Almost all states provide at least one Medicaid-funded self-direction offering for adults over age 65, for adults with physical disabilities, and adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. It's less available as an option for other populations. So for instance, people with serious mental illness, children who are medically fragile. It's not like these programs are available in every state all the time, but we are hearing from states they're signaling more interest in expanding these options. So that's a trend to watch. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, the COVID pandemic really did make a significant impact. People were looking to receive care at home and have more control over their care. Also, as I think many of you know, majority of states created temporary emergency options via their Appendix K, allowing for legally responsible individuals to provide care, which is an important feature of self-direction. States also talked about self-direction just really filling a critical void when a lot of other services were shutting down. And there was significant federal funding during this time period that helped galvanize the model. So we go to the next slide. It's important to note that in self-direction, there's both the option of having employer authority, where you can choose your own workers, and or budget authority, where you have decision-making power over your budget, can set the rate of wages for your workers, and can even, in some cases, purchase goods and services that support your independence. We found that in 2023, states that demonstrated the most growth in Medicaid-funded enrollment also tended to offer budget authority. So it starts to tell us a story that perhaps the more flexibility we give, the more people are opting in to self-direct. So the next slide. More than ever, we are seeing states have more sophisticated funding structures, specifically pairing their 1915C waivers with other funding authorities, including state plans, which in some ways really signals embedding self-direction more permanently in the structure of the state, in some cases making it something that everyone's eligible for. It meets the criteria. So we go to the next slide. We also looked closely at the workforce. Obviously, there is a self-direction, there's an overall workforce crisis impacting the home and community-based services sector. Interestingly, several states did report that self-direction really mitigated workforce shortages, particularly being able to hire paid family makes a difference. But at the same time, we also heard from states self-direction is in no way exempt from these concerning patterns in the direct care workforce crisis. So we really need to keep an eye on this. Lots of areas for future workforce to understand, including, what could be the positive impact of increased wages and benefits? What is the impact of paid family caregiving on availability of workforce? And what's the impact of budget authority? We see that that plays an important role too. I think there's a lot of potential in the future to be able to do deeper research, particularly working with financial management services providers using the data that they already collect oftentimes through their state contracts. So next slide, please. Future research that we are looking towards coming out of this most recent inventory as we're preparing for the next one is, again, continuing conversations about workforce, how self-direction can scale to support historically marginalized and underserved communities is going to be really critical. Not everyone has equal access to self-direction. Really understanding the difference in unmet needs between people who self-direct and people using traditional services. And then also understanding some of those states that had a decrease in enrollment. What does that due to? Is that maybe complicated enrollment processes? Is that EVV implementation not going well? We want to understand that better. So with that said, I think that covers all the trends, and I'm going to pass things over to Lindsay. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Molly. Okay, so I'm going to walk through our 2022-2023 national data on self-direction outcomes. So the next slide here shows a timeline of the surveys that comprise National Core Indicators, or NCI. NCI tools collect data on performance and quality of life directly from people who use disability and/or aging service systems, their families, and those who deliver services. Since the first NCI Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities Survey, or NCI-IDD, in 1997, we've had 48 states participate. And since launching the NCI Aging and Disabilities, or NCI-AD, in 2013, we've had 26 states participate. We also hear from 30 states for the NCI-IDD State of the Workforce and 5 on the NCI-AD State of the Workforce. On the next slide, we have the goals of our NCI tools, and really there's 3 aims: to establish a nationally recognized set of performance and outcome indicators for aging and disability service systems, to use valid and reliable data collection methods and statistical techniques so that we can capture and compare information directly for people who use services, and report those individual state results and national benchmarks of these system surveys. And any sort of frequently asked questions, you can check out our website. I think there should be a link in the chat. On the next slide, I just wanted to touch really briefly on the overall methods for collecting NCI data. So states work closely with HSRI, NASDDDS, and advancing states to design their samples to be representative of their service population. And on the AD survey, this is anyone who receives one active service at least twice a week from their state aging and disability service system. So that's the eligible population. On the IDD side, you need to be receiving at least one service in addition to case management. All of the surveyors that collect the data complete standardized training, and they also make sure to inform those who are surveyed that their responses are private, it's confidential, it's not going to impact their services or be shared with their service providers. Since COVID, many states have offered both in-person or remote interviews to complete these surveys. We do have the surveys in multiple languages, and we allow for the use of proxies for selected questions. On the next slide, we have a map showing the 18 states who participated in the 2022-23 NCI-AD. Altogether, we heard from more than 15,000 individuals, of which about a third were male. The average age was 67, and we see a fairly diverse sample in terms of race, ethnicity, and diagnosis. On the next slide, we have a map showing the 33 states that participated in the 2022-23 NCI-IDD. Altogether, we heard from more than 25,000 individuals, of which more than half are male. The average age was a little younger, around 40. And again, a fairly diverse sample when we look at the demographics like race and ethnicity and diagnosis. So before I jump into the data, on the next slide, I just wanted to share a small caveat about using NCI data for advocacy. A good analogy is to think about NCI data as an exit ramp. So the data can reveal patterns and trends and may point to a few areas where you want to look deeper at how your system is working. NCI data doesn't necessarily tell you all the root causes or the right solutions. It's not going to give you directions from start to finish, but it will tell you some possible exit ramps to take on your journey to quality improvement. Okay, so let's take a closer look first at who uses self-directed supports. So we'll go to the next slide as well. Thank you. And you'll see here 2 donut charts. And these donut charts represent the percent of respondents to the NCI-AD survey on the left of the screen and the NCI-IDD survey on the right of the screen. And this is the percent who are using self-directed supports. It's important to note that because not every waiver population might be sampled to the same extent, at a state in a given year, this is not necessarily a perfect proxy for the extent of self-direction in a state. But at the national level, it does give us a glimpse of who uses self-direction within state-funded LTSS populations. And as you can see here, the use of self-directed supports is about 2 times higher among the NCI-AD population at around 34% than the NCI-ID sample, which is 17% nationally. On the next slide, we have a packed circles graph. And so this is really intended to show us the use of self-directed supports broken down by age group. So within the NCI-AD and the NCI-IDD surveys, we see that the use of self-direction is lower among older respondents. And we also see that for each age group, the use of self-direction is higher among NCI-AD respondents. On the next slide, we have some demographics of people who use self-directed supports by race and ethnicity. And there are a lot of numbers in this table, so I'm just going to point out a few of the similarities and the differences for our 2 surveys that we're focused on today. So for both the NCI-AD and NCI-IDD surveys, we see the use of self-directed supports is higher for American Indian and Alaska Native respondents, and it's lower for Black respondents. We see some differences between the surveys, however, in terms of the use of self-direction among white respondents and Hispanic respondents. This is a really good example of why we think we need to think about NCI data as an exit ramp, because these numbers show interesting patterns, but ultimately we need some further research to really understand the factors that contribute to different rates of self-direction for different groups. The last slide that I have on demographics shows us the difference in the use of self-directed supports for those whose preferred means of communication is spoken and those who use sign language, gestures, or communication devices to communicate. I thought this was really interesting to see that in both the NCI-AD and the NCI-IDD, there are significantly higher rates of self-direction among those who prefer non-spoken forms of communication. And we're going to come back to this in a little bit when we look at some of the experiences. Okay, so on the next slide, we're going to turn to some slides that showcase outcomes related to the experience of self-direction. We can go ahead to the next slide, which shows us 2 tree maps of the responses to the question, who makes the decisions about the services that are self-directed? Ultimately, we see that not all people who use self-directed supports are making decisions about their services. And from these 2 tree maps side by side, we can see that that's much more common among NCI-IDD respondents. So on the NCI-AD survey, we see 60% of people say that they mostly make the decisions about the services that are self-directed. That's that teal box at the top. On the NCI-IDD, just 14% of people say they mostly make the decisions. Another 40% tell us that they have input and their family and friends help make the decisions. And 46% say that the decisions are made by someone else about those services that are self-directed. This might be related to high rates of guardianship in the NCI-IDD population, but to me, this really points out that there are some differences in how people are experiencing self-direction between our survey populations. On the next slide, we have a table showing the national data on measures of the experience of self-direction. The good news is that we see relatively high rates in both surveys of people saying that they have enough help deciding how to direct their services, that they can make changes to their services, and that they have the amount of control they want over those services that are self-directed. However, we also see that about 3/4 of NCI-AD respondents say that the services and supports they want to self-direct are always available, and about 2/3 of NCI-IDD respondents say this. And we also see about 1/3 of our NCI-AD respondents say they need help with at least one part of self-direction, like getting their staff paid, finding staff, managing benefits. And this is higher on NCI-IDD with about 1 in 2 respondents. So the next slide, we're going to take a closer look at some of these outcomes related to the experience of self-direction and how those are tied to demographics. And we've actually noticed some rather stark differences on both the NCI-IDD and NCI-AD surveys for people who prefer non-spoken forms of communication. And the pattern we see here is that they're a lot less likely to make or have input on self-direction decisions. So, while people who use sign language, gestures, or communication devices may use family, friends, and staff to help interpret their communication, they should absolutely have the same opportunities as their peers to make decisions about services. It may be that there are additional supports needed to facilitate decision-making, such as enhanced training for staff who provide self-direction supports, or updated requirements for individuals who help to develop person-centered service plans. The next slide just shows the data for who makes the decisions about services that are self-directed. And this is just for NCI-AD because the data looked very similar for IDD. So I just wanted to spotlight one of the surveys. And this is a stacked bar graph that shows the percent who say they mostly make the decisions, that they have input, or that someone else makes decisions. And one of the bars shows that breakdown for those who prefer spoken communication. That's the one at the top. And the bottom shows the breakdown for those who prefer non-spoken forms of communication. So as you can see, the dark green here shows the percent who say they mostly make the decisions. And it's 60% for those who use spoken communication, while just 12% of those who prefer non-spoken communication say that they mostly make the decision. If you look at the other end of the bar, the yellow side, you see that the percent who say someone else makes the decisions for them is just 13% for those who prefer spoken communication, while it's 56% for those who prefer non-spoken forms. It's almost an exact flip. I'll just finish with a quick look at the experience of self-direction by age group on the next slide. And I was actually somewhat surprised by these results, that they looked so similar across NCI-AD and NCI-IDD. So for these two figures, the green column represents those using self-directed supports who are 18 to 44. The teal is those 45 to 64, and the gray is the 65 plus group. So you see here for both NCI-AD and NCI-IDD, among those that are younger, that 18 to 44 group, they have lower rates of saying that the services and supports they want to self-direct are always available. And they have higher rates of saying that they need help with at least one part of self-direction compared to their older peers. As Molly mentioned, we know that there are long-standing workforce shortages that contribute to these numbers, but additional research is needed to understand the factors that contribute to younger adults having a different experience with self-direction so we can better plan for the future. Before I hand this over to Alicia and Christian, I just wanted to plug that we're in the process of developing some of these analyses into a full issue brief with more information. So stay tuned for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay. Hello, everyone. My name is Alicia Burma. Christian Moran and I are here to talk about the long-term care self-direction programs in Wisconsin. We both work in the Division of Medicaid Services and oversee different aspects of the adult Medicaid long-term care and also acute and primary care programs, including the programs we're going to be talking about today. Next. Today, we're going to cover a few topics, including the Wisconsin Long-Term Care Waiver Program landscape in Wisconsin, the IRIS Self-Direction Program overview, how Medicaid collaborates with participants, families, advocates, providers, and partners, and opportunities to improve growth and access to quality. We're also going to be talking about what we wish we knew when we started the program. Next slide. In Wisconsin, we have a number of adult long-term care waiver programs. All of them cover adults with disabilities and older adults. We know that every state looks different, but we're here to let you know more about the models in Wisconsin. So first, we have family care. There are about 53,000 individuals in this program. This is our adult long-term care managed program. The second program, which is really what we're going to be focusing on a lot today, is our IRIS program. IRIS stands for Include, Respect, I Self-Direct, and this is our self-direction program in Wisconsin. We have almost 27,000 individuals in this program. And the third program, waiver program in Wisconsin, is the partnership program. This has about 3,000 individuals. And this is a much smaller program. It's not statewide, and it covers acute and primary and long-term support services in Wisconsin. You can see on the right-hand side of the slide the NCI-AD data, and you can see that in family care, we do have a self-direction option, and 32% of those in family care choose this option. And this option allows individuals to self-direct some things in their managed care program, including they can choose some services, they can choose staff, create their own schedule and set standards for individuals who are working for them. So again, this is a small subset, and people can choose in this managed care program if they want to self-direct certain aspects. Secondly is the self-direction program, which is IRIS, and there are 100%, this is 99%, but 100% of individuals in this program do self-direct. And overall in Wisconsin, we have about 55% of individuals in a self-directed program of one sort or another. Next slide. Okay. So the history of the IRIS program. IRIS, again, is this fully self-directed program, which means that participants have the freedom to decide how they want to live their lives. It was created in 2008 for individuals over the age of 18 years old. Currently, the budget for this program is about $1 billion. This is a very large program. In IRIS, participants are supported by IRIS consultant agencies, we call those ICAs, and fiscal employer agents, or FEAs. Workers and agencies hired by IRIS participants are paid through the FEA. Next slide. The IRIS benefit package. So this includes vocational services, transportation, supportive home care, personal care, medical equipment and supplies, and counseling and therapeutic services. IRIS participants must have a nursing home level of care in order to qualify for the program, and IRIS participants receive a budget for long-term care services and supports. They manage their monthly budget, caregiver hiring, and their individualized plan. Next slide. This will give you a sense of the growth of the program, which has really been astronomical. You can see that in 2008 that we started off the program, and it has consistently increased year by year by significant amounts. So again, now we're at over or around 27,000 participants in the program. Next slide. So this map here on the right-hand side just shows both the FEA and ICA footprints within Wisconsin. So individuals have a choice of 4 FEAs and about 5 ICAs, and they are located in different parts of the states in different regions. So individuals have the choice depending on what region they are in. IRIS fiscal employer agencies help participants choose and manage the workers they hire, and the IRIS consultant agencies help participants manage their own care and handle the day-to-day program operations. We also have an IRIS self-directed personal care agency that we contract with that allows participants to hire, train, and oversee their personal care workers. Next slide, please. So we have what we call the IRIS Advisory Committee, and they're responsible for providing feedback on the program. And this is very important to the program. So they provide feedback to us on proposed changes to program policies, to the contracts we have with the various ICAs and FEAs, and also provide input on federal waivers. They help with giving feedback on the implementation of program operations and infrastructure. And they also provide feedback on reports such as NCI and state-led participant satisfaction surveys. The committee includes participants, their family members, providers, advocacy groups, and we spread that across all 3 target groups served by the program. So again, individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, those with physical disabilities, and older adults. just to highlight within the context of these meetings, we do have a public comment period. So anyone is welcome to come on and provide feedback to the committee and to the Department of Health Services on the program. I will now pass this along to Christian Moran, who will talk more about the IRIS waiver.
Great. Thank you, Alicia, again. My name is Christian Moran. I'm with the Wisconsin Division of Medicaid Services. Just wanted to take a few minutes to talk about the process we're currently in renewing our waiver for our self-directed program. So we operate IRIS under a 1915C waiver. And we are very excited about the opportunity to make updates to the waiver as we're only allowed, as this opportunity only comes around every 5 years. Our current waiver runs through the end of this year, so December 31st, and the new waiver will be effective January 1st of next year. And we want to take this opportunity to improve the policies and services to make our program better and keep it sustainable for the 27,000 people who are served by the program. In the next slide, I want to talk briefly about our outreach efforts we have done in the last year. So we began working on our waiver in earnest last spring. And as part of that process, we did an extensive outreach campaign. So at the onset, we wanted to get as much input as we could from program participants, families, and our partners, essentially all the people served by who support or have an interest in our program. And we conducted an online survey. We got input at our IRIS Advisory Committee that Alicia mentioned, as well as our tribal health directors. We held 2 virtual public input sessions, one in the day and one in the evening. And through all of those outreach efforts, we received over 2,100 comments. In the next slide, I want to briefly go over the different themes we had heard as a result of this outreach effort. So 6 major themes had surfaced from people who had responded to our outreach. The largest proportion of the comments we received were about services, about 40%. There was an equal share of comments about transportation, cultural competency, and integrity at about 15% each. And likewise about housing and self-direction at roughly 8%. And while transportation and housing are services, we decided to break those out separately given how many comments we had received about those services. I will note that many of the comments we received were about complex issues that couldn't be addressed solely through the waiver itself. So we've collected all of that input and are looking at other ways to address those issues outside the scope of the waiver. So either through policy changes, changes in our contracts with our vendors, or other means. In the next slide, in the next few slides, I'll briefly go over some of the themes we received. So again, we had received many comments about services. Just to give you an example of some of the comments we received, comments about employment and vocational services, need for better employment, training, job training, and support for those with disabilities looking to enter or stay in the workforce. I don't have time to read all of the comments in these slides, but we did want to highlight some of the direct feedback we received. So each of the slides you'll see in blue are direct comments we received. In the next slide, I want to briefly highlight the theme of transportation. We received a significant amount of comments around alternative transportation solutions. So using, for example, Uber and Lyft as a transportation option. We did, as Alicia mentioned, we have our family care managed care program, and we updated our waiver last year to include Uber and Lyft. In the next slide, I want to briefly draw upon some NCI data. So as a point of comparison, have the survey results for Wisconsin's 22-23 NCI-AD and NCI-IDD surveys on access to transportation. In the table on the left, you can see for our AD population, a slightly higher percentage of our IRIS participants said they have access to transportation to do things they want outside the home. So 86% of IRIS participants compared to 80% for family care. By comparison, the table on the right shows slightly the opposite for our IDD population. So 76% of our IDD population who do not self-direct say they have access to transportation, compared to 71% who self-direct. So as Lindsay mentioned earlier, we consider these results an exit ramp. So these results are helpful as we're looking to understand differences in how participants are experiencing our programs, and as we look to explore solutions to close these gaps. In the interest of time, I'm going to, if we could just briefly go through each of these very quickly. So you will receive these slides. So the next slide was touching on cultural competency. The following slide touched upon integrity, and the following slide touched upon housing. So when you have an opportunity to look at these slides, you'll see some of the actual comments we received from people who responded to our outreach efforts. And with that, I will turn it to Alicia for our closing slide.
Thank you, Christian. So in hindsight, as you saw in the previous slide that I shared, the program has grown very quickly. And so that's proposed some challenges for us over the years. When we created the program, we created it for a very small number of people. And in hindsight, we would have built policies and program infrastructure differently had we had known it was going to be about $1 billion program with 27,000 individuals as a part of it. It's in response to that, we've increased our internal resources in the IRIS program over the past number of years. We now have a larger cross-bureau structure, which helps us to manage the policy, the fiscal systems, and the oversight functions needed for this very large program. So I will pass this along to the next person.
Good afternoon. I'm Laura Vegas with NASDDDS and on the NASDDDS NCI team. So what does all this mean? What does it mean for us, and what are some of the takeaways from today and some future directions? One of the things we learned today is that the use of self-directed supports continues to expand across all the populations that we support in the country. And it's important to ensure that all populations have the same opportunity to find information about and access self-direction. And as self-direction expands, we need to measure and monitor the quality of self-direction. And continued research will be needed to explore more deeply the associations between the use of self-direction and community living outcomes. People have been really busy answering the questions in the chat. So thank you, everybody. I think that's all we have. Thanks everyone for coming. Sorry, I'm reading the questions. Thanks everyone for coming. Just a little bit about HSRI. They're all about improving systems and changing lives. They're a nonprofit organization founded in 1976, looking to craft community-based, person-driven solutions across service systems, and they gather research using a collaborative, inclusive, and participatory model, and they're a great partner, by the way. So thanks to everyone. Are there questions in the chat that we can answer before, or are people taking care of all of those?
Yes. Yeah, I saw a question about kind of self-direction for people with IDD, data on states that are supporting people to self-direct even when they have high support needs, like 24/7 support. So with the NCI data, we can look at that. We do have questions on kind of the extent of supports required, and we can look at self-direction for folks. And then in terms of comparisons to spending, Laura, I don't know if you or Molly potentially through applied self-direction, if there's any data you're familiar with that could, make that connection to state budgets related to self-direction.
This is Molly. I don't have access to that budget information, but I would love to have access to it. I want to know that story as well. I also just wanted to jump in on the other question where the person was asking about, kind of what does self-direction look like for individuals with IDD when their parents age out from being in a caregiver role. And I just want to acknowledge what an important and I think urgent question that is. This is coming up time and time and again in different spaces and places where we're talking to people who self-direct with IDD. And so I just wanted to say it's an important question. I know at Applied Self-Direction, we'd love the opportunity to dig in more to that because I think it's going to require, I think some people are already coming up with interesting solutions to that problem, but it's also going to require some innovation.
Any other questions that aren't being answered in the chat? Molly, there's one more question for you. It says, we hope you can help us learn about aging in place, about 24/7 supports, and that applied self-direction can be truly helpful.
Oh, well, I thank you, Maggie. I know who you are, and I appreciate that comment. And I'll just say, as a sibling of someone with IDD, this particular issue is very close to my heart.
Someone asked, is the independent facilitator like a support broker? Also, where is it required in statute to the previous question? Anyone want to take that one? Independent facilitator like a support broker?
Well, I'll do a quick response, Laura, and then Molly will want to jump in as well. The function of independent facilitators is part of CMS's definition of self-direction. If a state is doing self-direction, they have to provide independent facilitation. And states vary in terms of how they operationalize independent facilitation. It could be through contracted support brokers. It could be through the state case manager. It also, in some states, can be through a contracted staff person or personal agent who can serve that function. Our friends from Wisconsin and Molly may have other answers to that question.
I was a little distracted looking at all these inputs of people asking questions. But yeah, I will just reiterate, and forgive me if I'm repeating anything Val said, but nationally, every state structures their programs a little differently. Information and assistance is this broad category of kind of support that's different from a case manager, that's kind of your job coach teaching you to be an employer. And that looks and is called something different and is structured in different ways state to state. Thank you, Molly.
And there were some comments and questions about oversight of the FSA in states. And I'm wondering if Wisconsin has since we have a couple of minutes, would mind speaking to how they provide oversight of their self-directed work and ensure that the services are quality.
Sure. This is Alicia again. Yes, we have a whole team that ensures that our contracted entities, so the FEAs and the ICAs and the SDPC contracted agency are meeting the expectations of the contract. If they're not, we work with them and we also have a team to help solve problems where participants might be having disagreements with the program or concerns about the program. We also step in to make sure that those are resolved and work with our contracted entities to do that. If a contracted entity is not meeting the expectations of the contract, or there are major concerns, then we can hold them accountable through a corrective action plan. And so that is one tool that we use. There are sanctions if we choose to implement sanctions as well, but we really do try to have a collaborative working relationship with all of our contractors and work with them to make sure that the improvements are made.
Thank you, Alicia. And thanks to everyone. Thanks to our esteemed panel. I always learn a lot on these webinars, and I certainly did today. You'll see on your screen now just a post-webinar evaluation. We hope you'll take a couple of minutes and let us know how you thought we did. We're always looking for feedback to constantly improve the work that we do and the resources we provide. So have a great afternoon. And again, appreciate your participation and the active conversation in the question and answers. Thanks.